I'm with Hugh Kitson here at the Christian Media Summit. Now, Hugh, what are you doing here at the summit?
Well, this is the third one I've been to here in the land. The last two were virtual because of the pandemic, and it's great to be here to be able to network with everyone here and also to really see what's going on here in the land.
Is it important for Christians to come to the Christian Media Summit? This is something that's been put on especially for the Christians.
Well, certainly for those who are working in media, I do believe that's very important, as I've been working in media all my life, actually, 50 years. And right now we're producing a documentary series called Whose Land, which is looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law. And this is being presented by Colonel Richard Kemp, who's a good friend of mine. And we released the first part 5 years ago, and a combination of COVID and difficulty in raising funds has meant that it's gone into abeyance, but we're now doing the second part, which is what I've been doing here now, been shooting for the second and possibly a third part as well. And the second part in particular goes from 1948, the first part finishes in 48, and we look at the War of Independence and the legality of the right of Israel to all of Judea and Samaria. That's what we'll, and especially Jerusalem, of course, which is the biblical heartland of the nation of Israel.
So does Israel have a legitimacy here in the land?
Well, absolutely. Starting with the biblical side of it, you've got the Abrahamic covenant, and the land was promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob as an everlasting possession. So that's the spiritual side. Now going back to San Remo, which followed the Balfour Declaration, San Remo was in 1920, and then the mandate itself, that enshrined that right in international law. The historical connection of the Jewish people to the land, and of course where we're sitting right here in Jerusalem, was acknowledged, and the mandate became a treaty. Now, the mandate, the rights given to the Jewish people were to reconstitute their ancient homeland, and that is binding in international law. It was endorsed 100% by the League of Nations in 1922, and now, of course, that's the centenary of the League of Nations mandate. The ratification of it has been this year, and those rights were carried through into Article 80 of the UN Charter, and of course the UN Charter is a fully legal document, if you like.
But how is the UN today?
Yes. Actually, last Sunday we interviewed Danny Danon, who is Israel's previous ambassador to the United Nations. He was there from 2015 to 2020 and witnessed the Abraham Accords and the move of the embassy, although he was in New York when that happened. So he's presided in New York at a very important time with the United Nations. But the United Nations is a problem because they keep having these international resolutions against Israel, and quite frankly, they are contradictory to their own charter.
Are they anti-Semitic, do you think?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you're anti-Zionist, you have to be anti-Semitic. Israel is a Jewish state. It is legally recognized as the home of the Jewish people, and anti-Zionism really is the main form of anti-Semitism these days, with the whole BDS movement trying to delegitimize the existence of the Jewish state. So, and the UN is really carrying forward with this boycott, divestment and sanctions.
So even though you have all this boycott all the time, things are still positive because you have the normalization deals that have happened under Donald Trump. The embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and now Saudi Arabia are looking to normalize as well, aren't they?
Well, I hope they do. Danny Danon believes that there will certainly be other nations that come into the fold. But actually, the European Union, for instance, they've really put the Abraham Accords on the back burner, or they tend to ignore it, as does the British government. And things are moving ahead, and quite frankly, the Western world want to keep the old status quo with the victimization of the Palestinians and the denigrating of the Jewish state.
Well, we had a positivity with Liz Truss, who was talking about moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, she lost her power. Do you think there'll ever be a day where Great Britain will move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
Well, I would like to think so. I've been praying for that for years and years and years. But Britain needs to recognize, actually, that the British government historically is part of the problem that exists today. By the 1940s, in the post-war period, the then British government under Attlee and Ernest Bevin were absolutely dead against a Jewish state emerging, and they did everything they could to stop it happening. And consequently, we have the situation that has become embedded since then with the hostility of the surrounding Arab nations against the Jewish state, and particularly those who have become the Palestinians. And so, the fact that so many nations support these anti-Israel resolutions in the United Nations, which are basically authored by the Palestinian Authority, which unfortunately has observer status, and they get treated as a fully fledged nation, which in fact they're anything but.
Now you are a movie maker. What other movies have you made?
Well, I made Jerusalem the Covenant City more than 20 years ago, and that looks at the prophetic significance of Jerusalem. In fact, you could almost say that Jerusalem is the only city in the world whose history has been written in advance. So there's that. We did then the Forsaken Promise, which looks at the conduct of the British Mandate and the British betrayal of the Jewish people in their hour of need. Britain closed the borders to the ancient homeland, which she was obligated to open under international law, and consequently hundreds of thousands of Jewish people finished up in the death camps when they could have easily come here to Israel. But Britain's policy at that time was to appease the Arabs rather than really deal with the hostility. And that, to some degree, is the case even today.
As a British Christian, why do you support Israel, and why should others support Israel as well?
Well, this whole Middle East conflict is basically a spiritual conflict. As a Bible believer, I believe the Lord Jesus Christ is going to return here to Jerusalem, and I can see the Mount of Olives over your shoulder as I speak, and that's where he's coming. And let me put it this way, the Lord is not going to return to Al-Quds, which is the Arabic name for Jerusalem, as the capital city of an Islamic Palestinian state, and moreover a Palestinian state which is Judenrein, to use that German term, free of Jews in other words. So that is really the nub of the whole conflict, is Satan's ploy to try and stop the Lord returning.
What's your prayer for the land?
Well, of course, one does pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but my sense is that actually that will only happen when the Lord does return. So we're in a conflict zone, and Jew hatred, Judeophobia, I sometimes use that term rather than anti-Semitism, is on the rise all over the world. And as I observe things, I'm very sad to say that there are a good many nations around the world who are actually members of the United Nations who would be quite happy if Israel just disappeared. And that's part of the battle. The Lord has said he's going to come back and he's going to rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about your documentary programs?
Right. If you go to www.whoseland.tv, you can see all about Whose Land, which, by the way, is not aimed at a Christian audience, it's aimed at a secular audience. And then you can go, the other films that I've done in the past are on Hatikva's website, which is hatikvafilms.com.
Okay, Hugh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you again.